Have you ever been told to your face, "We don't serve people like you, even when you had everything it takes to belong there"? Liora Bennett knew that feeling all too well. 8 p.m. She stood in the lobby of Le Périgord, the restaurant Manhattan's elite call heaven on earth. A perfectly tailored navy suit, a Patek Philippe catching the golden light, and in her hand a reservation confirmation with her name printed clearly on it. But the woman at the reception desk didn't see a guest. She only saw skin color. "Ma'am, we don't serve people like you. McDonald's down the street might be more your speed." Then Rip the paper was torn in half, falling onto the marble floor like a verdict, "You don't belong here." The luxurious dining room fell silent. Forks froze mid-air. Phones came up, recording the scene, a black woman being humiliated in public. But Liora didn't cry. She didn't rage. She just glanced at her watch and said softly, 15 minutes. 15 minutes for what? No one knew. No one could imagine. They saw a woman being shamed. They didn't see the text that had already been sent. They didn't see the black Escalade idling outside, engine running, waiting for the signal. They didn't see the plan that had been months in the making and how this dinner reservation was only the opening move. In 15 minutes, no one in that room would be the same, and this restaurant would no longer belong to the people who despised her. Have you ever been rejected from a place where you knew you belonged? Share your story in the comments because the next story could be yours. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss more jaw-dropping reversals like this one. Stay tuned because the next 15 minutes will make you never look at a dinner table the same way again. Liora Bennett never rushed when walking into a room. She had learned that lesson: early speed isn't power, it's how people mask their insecurity. Tonight, as the Patek Philippe on her wrist hit exactly 8 o'clock, she pushed open the heavy wooden doors of Le Périgord, the restaurant Manhattan so proudly called a heaven for those who know where they belong. Her navy suit hugged her slender frame. Her hair was neatly pinned up, and her low heels made no sound against the marble floor. Liora dressed like someone who belonged in rooms like this, someone who understood the unspoken codes of the elite. But that was exactly why her presence stood out even more alert, unbowed, with no attempt to make herself fit into the carefully constructed atmosphere around her. Golden lights washed over white linen tables. The clinking of glasses mixed with the quiet hum of a live violin. On the walls, oil paintings of white men in tuxedos sipping wine served as an unspoken reminder this wasn't a place for everyone. This was their place. Liora inhaled slowly, letting the chill in her chest dissolve. Eyes darted her way, scanning every detail: her skin, her hair, the way she carried herself. Some offered polite smiles, the kind reserved for strangers who had tried hard. Others didn't bother to hide their surprise, as if her presence had stained the room. For a moment, she heard her mother's voice echoing from memory, like a familiar soundtrack. You'll walk into rooms where their eyes will tell you you don't belong. But remember, if you don't leave, you've already won half the battle. Her mother had once been thrown out of a country club pool for daring to step in with her skin. That story had become the quiet fire inside Liora. When they didn't want to see her, she would stay longer, stronger. She walked toward the host stand, each step counting out her heartbeat. The reservation confirmation landed on the glossy counter beside the silver bell. Liora didn't speak. She didn't need to explain who she was. 15 minutes, she thought. 15 minutes before everything would change. And no one in this room had the faintest idea what they were about to witness. The woman behind the host stand was Camille, blonde curls perfectly coiffed, white gloves fitted to her fingers like she was working at a gala, not checking in guests. Camille glanced at the reservation slip, then at Liora. It wasn't the look of an employee greeting a patron. It was the look of someone deciding who had the right to step past this door and who didn't. Her smile was as cold as steel. "Ma'am," Camille purred, savoring every syllable. We don't serve people like you. McDonald's down the street might be more your speed." Then, without hesitation, Camille tore the paper in two. The sound of ripping paper was sharp, merciless, like a verdict being read aloud. The torn pieces fell onto the marble floor, lying under Liora's heels like discarded dignity. The room froze. Forks and knives stilled. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. A few diners subtly lifted their phones, recording the scene. They didn't know if they were capturing a scandal, a historic moment, or just another quiet humiliation in the endless string of such moments. Camille crossed her arms in triumph, blocking the path like a living wall. "The remaining tables are reserved for our regulars," she added, her voice low but loud enough for others to hear, people who fit the atmosphere here. That word "fit" landed like a blade. Nobody needed an explanation for what it meant. Liora bent down, picked up the torn paper, and set it back on the counter, a final, quiet jab at this performance of fake civility. She didn't look at Camille. She didn't need to. People like Camille never thought they were wrong. Instead of arguing, Liora glanced at the wall clock. Then she looked down at her watch, the second hand of her Patek Philippe moving steadily. 15 minutes, she said, her voice light as a whisper but loud enough for Camille and those nearby to hear. Camille arched an eyebrow. 15 minutes for what, ma'am? Liora didn't answer. There was only the faintest curve of a smile at the corner of her lips, the kind people who underestimated her would recognize too late. This wasn't some nameless guest. A man at a nearby table leaned toward his companion and whispered, "Who is she? Why is she so calm?" No one in that room knew the answer, but they all shared the same thought. What could make someone stand so still after being humiliated like this? They didn't know, but they were about to find out, because the next 15 minutes would make sure nothing in this room remained the same. Liora stood perfectly still, like she'd been frozen into the oil painting behind Camille. The only difference? In the painting. The white men in tuxedos were smiling at each other. Liora, meanwhile, had become the centerpiece of a cruel little spectacle. The humiliation crept in like a dull blade sliding between her ribs, quiet, heavy, but unrelenting. But Liora had learned how to carry those blades her whole life without spilling blood. This wasn't restraint. This was calculation. They wanted her to react, to rage, to hand them a reason to make her the problem. She wouldn't give them that gift. The first phone went up, then another. The curious eyes in the room shifted roles from bystanders to witnesses. Someone muttered, "Oh my God, I have to record this." A click, then another, in seconds. The story had already begun to slip past the velvet-lined walls of Le Périgord and into the veins of the internet where no painting held enough power to stop people from talking. The first comment popped up on the live stream. "Who is she? Why so calm?" Another followed. "This is Manhattan 2025, and this still happens." The view count climbed, ticking upward like the second hand on her watch, each passing moment pulling in dozens more eyes from across the city. Liora heard the faint ping of a notification from her purse. She knew the video had reached exactly where it needed to go, but she didn't rush to check. She kept standing there, looking like she was enduring, but in reality, she was waiting. 13 minutes. She glanced at her watch. Camille's fingers drummed on the counter, her patience thinning. "Are you still standing here? I told you we don't have a table for you." Liora said nothing. She could hear the clinking of silverware resuming, the nervous, polite chuckles attempting to smooth over the tension. But every sound felt like tissue paper covering a bomb that was already ticking. A middle-aged man near the door leaned over to his wife. "Something's off. No normal person just stands there like that." His wife nodded. "She's waiting for someone." They weren't wrong, but what the entire room didn't know was this: she wasn't just waiting for a person. She was waiting for a moment. 12 minutes. The second hand ticked forward. She closed her eyes briefly. exhaling as if to tell herself stay. Just like Mom said, stay. When she opened them again, the room hadn't changed. The same white tablecloths, the same cold faces. But outside, the world had already begun to tremble with this story. And they, the ones who thought they controlled the narrative, had no idea they were the ones already on the table. 11 minutes. And the storm hadn't even begun. In the far right corner of the restaurant, Zadie Cruz set her phone on a small stand beside her wine glass. At first, she only meant to capture a few shots of the service for her usual review. As a Latinx food blogger, Zadie was used to the sweet but stinging rituals of places like this: polite smiles for white patrons, clipped tones for everyone else. But when she heard the words "McDonald's would suit you better" ring out so clearly, she knew she had just caught something no one ever dared imagine. Zadie hit livestream, angling the camera directly at the host stand. "Hey, everyone," she said, her voice low but shaking with restrained fury. "We're in Manhattan. It's 2025. And you just heard them tell a black woman that McDonald's would be more appropriate for her? That's right, you heard me. And this is Le Périgord, the place famous for its so-called high-class service." The numbers in the corner of the screen spiked. 20 viewers, then 40. Within a minute, over 300. Comments flooded in. "What restaurant is this? Are you kidding me? In 2025? Zoom in. Who is she?" Zadie moved her phone closer. Liora still stood there, silent and unmoving, a statue in a room heavy with judgment. She didn't flinch at the insults. And that unshakable stillness made the frame impossible to look away from. Within 5 minutes, viewership hit 800. Then someone dropped a comment hashtag Le Périgord racism. Share this now. Like a spreading oil slick, the hashtag appeared on other accounts. A notification popped up on Zadie's screen. A famous food blogger had just shared her live stream. Then a freelance journalist. "Anyone with info on this story, DM me." Everything was slipping beyond the velvet walls of this restaurant, beyond its white tablecloths and soft golden lights, and into a space where no host's polite smile could stop the truth from spreading. At the host stand, Camille didn't notice the ground shifting. She still stood there with her arms crossed, smug as a woman who thought she'd just won a small, satisfying battle. But outside, an invisible trial had already begun. No lawyers, no judge, just the internet, and it was watching. Zadie glanced at the pinned comment at the top. Who is she? How is she so calm? That question echoed in the minds of everyone watching. But soon, it wouldn't be a question anymore. Because in just a few minutes, they'd get their answer, one no one in this room could have seen coming. A man emerged from the back, straightening his tie like he'd just left an important meeting. Peter Lang, Le Périgord's manager, a familiar face to its regulars. Tall, trim, hair slicked to perfection. He walked over with the kind of smile that had been rehearsed 100 times, the kind restaurants use to smother trouble before it spreads. "What seems to be the issue here?" Peter asked. His voice honeyed, but his eyes swept Liora from head to toe in a single second. They lingered on her skin longer than politeness allowed. Then he turned to Camille. "Problem." Camille tilted her head like a child reciting a lesson. She insists she had a reservation. But we all know we're fully booked tonight. Peter nodded, as if that was all he needed for his verdict. He turned back to Liora. The smile dropped, replaced by something colder, superior. "Ma'am, I'm afraid you've misunderstood. We serve guests who fit the atmosphere here. So. I'm sure you understand what I mean. Fit the atmosphere. Polished words with a blunt, ugly edge. No one in the room needed him to explain. Liora met his gaze, letting the silence stretch like a taut wire. Then she slowly tilted her head toward the dining room. "Interesting," she said, her voice soft, almost as if commenting on a dish. Those 7 empty tables. I guess they're waiting for the kind of guests who fit this atmosphere, too. The words dropped into the room like a drop of ink into clear water. The chatter rose. An older couple near the host stand put down their silverware, exchanged a look, and signaled for their check. They stood, leaving their half-finished wine behind not because of the food, but because they didn't want their dinner to be the backdrop to this scene. "What the hell is going on here?" a young man near the door said, loud enough for others to hear. From the far corner, a woman scoffed, turning to her date. "Can you believe that?" She actually said, "McDonald's would suit you better." In Manhattan. Peter felt the air shifting but kept his velvet-wrapped tone. "I think it would be best for everyone if you left, before things get too noisy." Liora didn't answer. She simply glanced at her watch. 9 minutes. The ticking in her chest was louder than the clinking of glasses around her. Zadie kept her live stream rolling, whispering into her mic. "Do you see this? She hasn't moved. Not an inch. This isn't dinner anymore. This is a test of endurance, and I think they're about to fail." The room had become a stage, and no one was sure who the real main character was anymore. But they still didn't know that the real performance hadn't even begun. Liora stood there, letting the humiliation cling to her like a cold seeping into her bones. But inside, every vein in her body was vibrating with an old memory she thought she'd buried. She was 14 again, in a cheap, light blue swimsuit her mother had bought on sale. She remembered the red brick walls of the country club, the chlorine-heavy air, the laughter of kids playing in the pool. She and her mother had barely stepped inside before a man in a polo shirt with the club's logo blocked their path. He said the same thing Camille had just repeated, only in different words. "We don't serve people like you." Her mother didn't argue. She just turned, pulling her daughter away from a place they were never truly invited. On the way home, she gripped Leora's hand tight, her eyes fixed on the sidewalk as if looking up would shatter her completely. "You'll walk into rooms where their eyes will tell you you don't belong, but remember, if you don't leave, you've already won half the battle." That memory never left. It burned quietly, shaping a vow no one would define her worth by denying her presence. And tonight, under the golden lights and soft violin music, Camille and Peter had repeated that lesson, except this time, she wasn't 14 anymore. She looked at her watch. 12 minutes. Time crawled, as if stretching the discomfort of everyone in the room. But for Liora, each second was a rung on a ladder leading to a moment they couldn't imagine. Camille still stood there, arms crossed like a small queen guarding her domain. Peter's eyes darted to the phones recording him, trying to gauge how bad this might get. Neither of them realized every glance. Every word was now evidence, live-streamed to thousands. Zadie whispered into her mic, "She's not leaving. She's waiting. For someone, or something. What do you all think?" Comments flew. "Why is she so calm? Does anyone know who this woman is?" Liora didn't need to read the comments to know. She could feel the eyes both in the room and out there fixed on her. But instead of feeling small, she felt in control. They had made her into a spectacle. And she would turn this spectacle into their reckoning. She smoothed the front of her blazer, lifting her chin. 11 minutes. They thought they knew how this night would end. But tonight's story was no longer theirs to write. And none of them could yet imagine that when the clock hit its final mark, everything from this room to the people standing in front of her would be turned upside down. Outside the restaurant, where Manhattan's weekend night still blazed with streetlights and the restless hum of a city that never sleeps. A black Escalade idled at the curb like a predator waiting for the signal to strike. Its engine purred low, a restrained growl just enough to remind anyone listening that it hadn't been abandoned there. The driver, a broad-shouldered man in a black suit, glanced at his watch every so often, then back at the restaurant's front doors. He wasn't restless. He wasn't impatient. He simply held himself in a posture of readiness, because he knew the cardinal rule of the woman he was waiting for Liora. Bennett never rushed. Every minute she spent inside was a calculated move, and every move had a purpose. In the back seat sat a leather briefcase, perfectly placed. Inside were documents that, if anyone at Le Perigord knew of them tonight, they would have wiped the smug smiles off their faces. Everything was ready. All that remained was the right moment. Inside the restaurant, Liora slowly pulled her phone from her bag. Her fingers moved across the screen deliberately, as though each keystroke was its own silent strike. She typed 3 words. Option 3. Prepare. No one nearby knew what that meant. Camille probably assumed she was texting friends to complain. Peter likely thought she was grasping at some way to salvage a ruined night. And the diners filming from the shadows, all they saw was a black woman calmly sending a text while being publicly humiliated. But outside, in the Escalade, a phone on the back seat buzzed. The driver read the message, gave a single nod like a soldier receiving orders. Option 3. Not the first option, not the easy one. But it was the one Liora had prepared long ago for a night like this, a night she knew would eventually come. She didn't believe places like Le Perigord could change. She only believed in the power of making them pay the price. She set her phone down, her gaze fixed on the host stand. 9 minutes. The second hand on her Patek ticked forward, its rhythm merging with the low hum of the murmuring room. Outside, the Escalade waited. Inside, a plan had just been activated. And those who thought they controlled this room didn't yet realize the board they were playing on tonight had never belonged to them. 8 minutes, and the real game was just beginning. Peter turned to a server in a black uniform standing near the entrance. "Get security," he ordered. His voice had shed its velvet veneer. It was back to the voice of a man who believed no one would dare defy him. 2 men appeared within minutes. One, tall, broad-shouldered Glenn, barely 6 months on the job. The other shorter, heavier, with sharp eyes Luis, whose glance swept over Liora like he just wanted this to end quickly. Peter pointed at Liora. "If she doesn't leave, remove her." The words dropped into the room like a stone into a still pond, shattering the fragile surface. Whispers rippled. Someone sucked in a breath loud enough to be heard. A woman turned her phone. Lens now pointed squarely at Glenn and Luis. A silent reminder. Everything you do is being watched. Glenn approached Liora. He wasn't much older than her, his face still holding the softness of someone who hadn't yet learned to mask his unease. His hand brushed the radio on his shoulder but didn't move quickly. Liora locked eyes with him so calm it slowed his steps. "What's your name?" she asked. He blinked. "Glenn." "Ma'am?" "Glenn," she said softly, her tone conversational yet loud enough for others to hear. "Did you ever dream of being a hero? Or just another tool to throw people like me out of places like this?" The question cut slowly, not to wound, but to reach the part of him he'd never had to confront. Glenn froze. His hand dropped to his side. He had never thought of his job like that. Luis frowned at him. "Do it," he muttered. "Peter's watching." But Glenn didn't move. Leora's words echoed in his mind. A hero or a tool? Peter cleared his throat, trying to reclaim control. I said, "Remove her," but this time the command lacked the weight it had before. Even he could feel the balance shifting in a way he didn't understand. Liora held Glenn's gaze for a beat longer, then glanced at her watch. 7 minutes. She knew she'd planted a seed, and given time, it would grow. The room had fallen silent, not a restaurant anymore, but an arena. And everyone was waiting to see who would make the first move. Liora inhaled deeply, grounding herself in the thick tension of the room. Her eyes never left Glenn, but her mind drifted elsewhere. "I'm not standing here just for me," she reminded herself. I'm standing here for my parents, the ones who were turned away as if they were invisible. She remembered the countless times her parents came home from stores, parties, restaurants, faces tight, swallowing their humiliation so their kids wouldn't see. She remembered her mother's eyes fixed on her shoes when she was told, "You're not allowed in here." She remembered her father's knuckles whitening on the steering wheel as they drove away from the places they weren't welcome. Those memories hadn't vanished. They'd been waiting, and tonight, they walked back into this room with her dressed in a tailored navy suit and carrying a plan no one here could fathom. She closed her eyes briefly, feeling the steady tick of the Patek on her wrist. 10 minutes. When she opened them, she scanned the room, white tablecloths, sparkling glasses catching the golden light, diners pretending to continue their meals while eavesdropping on every breath, every word. Camille still stood behind the host stand, arms crossed, that half-smile plastered on her lips. She'd seen this play out before a humiliated guest leaves, and order is restored. But tonight, that script was unraveling minute by minute, second by second. Peter stepped closer, filling the space Glenn hadn't. "You're making this harder on yourself," he said, his faux politeness fully stripped away. Liora didn't answer. She stared at him, eyes cold as glass. Who's making this hard for whom she thought but didn't bother saying aloud? On Zadie's phone, the comments kept pouring in. What is she doing? Why hasn't she left? Does anyone know who she is? The viewer count ticked upward, more eyes pointed at this room, more witnesses to what was about to unfold. Liora knew what they were all thinking. What is she waiting for? She glanced at her watch, 9 minutes. In her mind, every piece of the plan was locking into place. She wasn't just waiting. She was counting down to a moment Peter, Camille, and everyone here would never forget. And when it came, they'd realize her calm wasn't endurance. It was a warning. The room stayed quiet, but everyone could feel it. Something was about to happen. And when it did, none of them would leave this place the same. The atmosphere inside Le Périgord had shifted completely. No one cared about their prime rib or $1,000 wine anymore. The room sat in a hush, like it was waiting for a dramatic score to swell. Forks no longer clinked against porcelain. Whispers replaced polite chatter. Occasionally, a phone buzzed, only to be silenced instantly, as if everyone knew they were witnessing something more important than the luxury dinner they'd paid to be here for. Liora stood as still as a statue, a crack in the elegant painting Le Périgord prided itself on preserving. But no one dared look at her with pity anymore. Her composure, the way she refused to be shoved out like a defeated guest, had shifted how people saw her. On Zadie's livestream, the viewer count passed 1,500. Comments flooded like a breached dam. "Who is she? Don't you dare leave. Stay right there. This needs to be on the news." Someone had already tagged Le Périgord racism with the restaurant's address, and it was spreading like wildfire. Peter knew he was being watched not just by the eyes in the room, but by the unseen ones out there, staring through phone screens. Yet he clung to his smug, superior smile, the one he believed could maintain order in a place like this. And then the glass doors opened. That sound, though small, cracked like thunder before a storm. Every head turned toward it. A man stepped inside, walking with the quiet authority of someone who'd owned every room he'd ever entered. Victor Harrington. A perfectly tailored suit, wine-colored tie, polished black shoes reflecting the golden lights above. Anyone familiar with Manhattan's finance world would know the name the most formidable deal attorney in mergers and acquisitions. A man who only appeared when power was in play at a level most New Yorkers could never dream of touching. Peter faltered. Camille blinked, her smug half-smile faltering, and those watching the live stream seemed to hold their breath. Victor scanned the room, his gaze landing on Liora. He gave her a nod, the kind exchanged between people who knew each other well enough not to need introductions. Liora glanced at her watch. 6 minutes. No one had time to ask what this man was doing here before the feeling in the room made it clear this wasn't just another guest, and this was no longer just another evening. Because when someone like Victor Harrington showed up, the rules of the room were about to be rewritten. Peter stepped forward, squaring his shoulders like a dog protecting his territory. His voice carried the same arrogance he'd always used to keep the unworthy in their place. "You're in the wrong place," Peter said, glancing at Victor before turning his sneer back to Liora. "This is a restaurant, not a courtroom." The words were meant to pull the room back to its old balance. Instead, they only tightened every gaze on Peter on the absurd confidence of a man who couldn't see the tidal wave rising beneath him. Victor didn't answer. He simply set his leather briefcase on a nearby table, moving with the patience of someone who knew time was his to control. His eyes swept the room and finally settled on Peter a look cold enough to remind him every game has limits. Liora took a slow step forward, her voice soft but clear enough to carry across the room. "Oh, Peter," she said, so polite, it could have passed as casual conversation. "Thank you for reminding me of something important." Peter frowned, caught off guard, but before he could respond, she continued. "I hate dining at places I don't own." The words dropped slowly, but their echo hit like a wrong note played loud in a symphony hall. Silence. Not the kind from moments earlier, when people were just quietly watching. This was the silence of people realizing they might be standing in the middle of a story no one had told them the script for. Camille's smile vanished. A few diners even lowered their phones, suddenly wanting to witness this with their own eyes. Unfiltered. Zadie didn't miss a beat. "Did you hear that she whispered into her phone? Still streaming. Did you hear that line? Do you think she's joking? Or was that a statement?" The comments exploded. "What did she just say? She owns. What, someone explain this?" Peter laughed a brittle, off-key sound. "That's adorable," he said, trying to inject disdain into his faltering tone. "Who exactly do you think you are? Some billionaire here to save the night?" Liora didn't answer. She just met his gaze. Her eyes held no anger, no defensiveness, only the kind of quiet certainty that makes a man realize he's standing at the edge of a cliff. 5 minutes? The second hand on her watch ticked forward, and though most people in the room didn't yet understand, they could feel it. She'd just signaled something monumental was coming. And when it came, no one here would walk away the same. Zadie leaned closer to her phone, whispering like she was sharing a secret with the thousands now tuned in. "Y'all, I don't think she's just any guest. Something big is about to happen. I don't know what it is, but don't look away." The comments rolled in. "Relentless. What did she mean by that? Who's that guy? Anyone recognize him? I've seen that man on finance news. Oh, This is huge." The viewer count climbed 1,700. 1,800, as if the entire city had paused dinner to watch this moment unfold. Inside the restaurant, a few diners were beginning to understand this was no longer about a woman being denied service. They adjusted in their seats, sitting up straighter, eyes fixed like they were watching a public trial, one where those who'd wielded power would have the table flipped in front of them. Peter didn't notice. He couldn't. He stood there, still playing the role of the gatekeeper, unaware that the walls of his authority were crumbling. Camille, though, swallowed hard and took a small step back, the instinct of someone realizing they might have pushed things too far past the safety line. Liora glanced at her watch. 4 minutes. She could feel the room breathing with her every gaze clinging to her like she was about to unlock a code. In the drawn-out silence, she felt her parents standing behind her, those long-buried memories now fueling the steel in her spine as she faced the storm. Victor still said nothing. He simply opened his briefcase, laying it on the nearest table, The slow, deliberate motion was enough for those who knew his name to understand this dinner had officially gone far beyond Le Perigord's comfort zone. Zadie whispered into her stream, "If you're watching this, share it. This is the story everyone's going to be talking about tomorrow morning." 3 minutes. The second hand ticked again. And in that stillness, everyone felt it something larger than this restaurant, larger than the humiliation that started it all, was about to be revealed. And when it came, no one would ever see this night or this place the same way again. Victor set the leather briefcase on the small table by the door, unlocking it with a calmness that didn't belong in a room this tense. The air inside froze. No one moved. No one dared to speak. Even the soft violin music from the house ensemble seemed to falter, as if it too were waiting for him to say something. He pulled out a carefully bound stack of documents, the cover stamped with the unmistakable seal of a top Manhattan law firm. His fingers turned the first page. His eyes scanned the bold print before lifting his gaze to Peter. When Victor finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, and clear, every word reverberating against the wood-paneled walls of Le Perigord. "As of 8:05 p.m. tonight," Victor said, emphasizing every syllable, "Le Perigord is the property of Bennett Hospitality Group." Silence. Not the polite hush of a fine dining room, but the thick, electric silence of people collectively realizing they were witnessing a moment that would change everything. Peter blinked several times, as if trying to process the words, before letting out a dry, disbelieving laugh. "You're joking. What is this? Some kind of performance?" But no one laughed with him. Camille took a small step back, lips pressed tight. The diners, who'd stayed silent up to this point, began exchanging glances, whispering in disbelief. Zadie gripped her phone tighter as her live stream exploded with comments. "What just happened? Who is Bennett Hospitality?" "Oh my God," she wasn't kidding about buying it. Liora said nothing. She simply looked at Peter and Camille not as a humiliated guest, but as someone standing in a room that now belonged to her. Victor continued, his tone cool and businesslike, as though this were just another day in the office. "The acquisition contract has been executed. Legal ownership is effective as of 8:05 p.m. All current employees will be notified of personnel adjustments within the next 30 minutes. Peter's shoulders slumped. He didn't argue. Deep down, he understood this wasn't a joke. This was reality, and it was more brutal than any superiority he'd ever wielded over others. Camille swallowed hard, her hand brushing the polished host stand like it could still anchor her to the authority she'd just lost. Zadie whispered into her stream, voice trembling with excitement. "Oh! We just witnessed one of the biggest power flips I've ever seen. She didn't come here for dinner. She came here to own the place." 2 minutes. Liora glanced at her watch, and everyone in that room understood the game had officially changed hands. But they didn't know this was only the beginning. Liora took a deliberate step forward, her every movement rehearsed in her mind. Her gaze stopped first on Peter, whose self-importance now looked like an ill-fitting coat, unable to cover the panic written all over him. Then she turned to Camille, frozen behind the host stand, fingers laced together as if she could still find safety in the familiar varnished wood. "You have 30 minutes, Liora said. Her voice wasn't loud or rushed, but it carried, sharp and undeniable, to clear out. No extra words, no explanations, just an order. Peter opened his mouth, ready to protest, but nothing came out. Victor's earlier statement still rang in his ears like a red-stamped verdict. Camille said nothing either. She stared at the documents in Victor's hand, desperate to find a loophole, a mistake, anything. But there was nothing. The restaurant erupted in a low rumble. Diners who had remained silent now openly exchanged comments, their hushed disbelief turning into audible words. An older couple near the door broke the tension first. The man placed his napkin on the table, stood, and began to clap. Slowly. Deliberately. The applause cracked through the heavy air like a hammer shattering Peter's proud little atmosphere. His wife joined him, clapping in rhythm. Zadie nearly shouted into her live stream. "Do you see this? She just fired them right here, in front of all of us." The comments erupted. "This is insane, minute by minute. She's flipping the whole script. This is what justice looks like." A group of younger diners at a back table let out a small cheer, like they were watching a comeback victory in the final seconds of a game. Other guests, who had been quietly watching Peter and Camille's performance, couldn't hide their smiles relieved to watch the invisible walls of Le Périgord crumble in real time. Peter lowered his head, fists clenched, and turned away, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Camille gathered her papers in frantic, clumsy motions, like someone clutching at the last scraps of their dignity. Liora stayed exactly where she was. No gloating, no smile. Her silence was louder than any declaration the power dynamic tonight had shifted for good. 1 minute. Zadie whispered to her thousands of viewers. "If this is the beginning, I can't imagine what comes next." And everyone in that room knew she was right. This wasn't over. Liora walked toward the host stand, the same one where Camille had once stood as the gatekeeper of this so-called exclusive world. Now, it was nothing more than a pedestal for what came next. She placed a small ivory business card on the polished surface, right where Camille had leaned when she'd looked down on her. "Now," Liora said, pausing just long enough to cut through the room like glass. "Do I fit your atmosphere?" No shouting, no raised tone, but each word sliced cleanly, severing every illusion of the refined environment Peter had been so proud to preach. Camille didn't dare look at the card, but those near enough saw the name clearly. Liora Bennett, CEO, Bennett Hospitality Group. No one needed an explanation. The name said it all. Zadie's voice shook as she breathed into her live stream. "Y'all, do you see this? She didn't just win the argument. She owns this place. This isn't guest versus restaurant anymore. This is owner versus property." Viewers surged past 2,000, comments pouring like a summer downpour iconic. "This is the classiest revenge I've ever seen. That's silent power at its finest." Peter turned away, his face flushed with humiliation. Camille bowed her head, her hands trembling as she packed up the last of her things, clinging to whatever shred of self-respect she could salvage. But everyone knew they were no longer players in this game. Liora stood still for a moment, letting the weight of it all sink in for everyone present. Then she turned toward Victor. "Let's get started," she said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Victor nodded, gathering his documents with the same unshakable calm, as if this were nothing more than another day at the office. But everyone there knew this wasn't just a business deal. It was a declaration that power changes hands, and sometimes it changes in the quietest, most ruthless way possible. There was no time left to count. Liora's watch hit 8:10. Zadie whispered to her viewers, voice trembling with awe. "If you think the show's over, you're wrong. I just heard they're calling an all-staff meeting tonight." The door to the private dining room opened. Liora and Victor stepped inside, leaving behind a room that still hadn't caught its breath after the storm. The servers stood to the side, their eyes a mix of confusion and hope. Because if what they'd just witnessed was only the prelude, the emergency meeting tonight would decide everything. The private dining room at Le Périgord had never held this much tension. The leather chairs once reserved for Manhattan's elite were now filled with the very people who cleared their plates, poured their wine, and polished their silverware. Some sat shoulder to shoulder, others stood pressed against the paneled walls, all eyes locked on the woman at the head of the table. No one spoke. No one even dared to cough. Liora didn't need a microphone. She didn't need to pound on the table to command the room. Her presence alone pulled the oxygen out of the air. The navy suit still fit her like armor, but her voice wasn't that of a humiliated customer anymore. It was the voice of an owner firm, unmistakable, and leaving no room for negotiation. "We're starting now," she said, sweeping her gaze across the room. "As of tonight, Le Périgord will no longer be a place where a select few think they can decide who has the right to exist here. It will be a real restaurant, a place where every guest is respected, regardless of skin color, accent, or the size of their wallet." She paused, letting her words settle. A few glances darted between employees' confusion and caution mixing in their eyes. "This is how it's going to work." Her tone was flat, contractual, deliberate. 40 hours of mandatory training hospitality, anti-bias, and cultural competency. Complete it, and you'll receive a 20% pay raise. Refuse or fail to commit. Walk out the door. A wave of murmurs broke through the silence. A young server in the corner whispered to a coworker, then stared down at the floor. Glenn, the young security guard who hadn't yet left, sat up straighter, his eyes fixed on Liora like her words carried more weight than his paycheck. "Don't misunderstand," Liora added, her voice edged with a faint, icy sarcasm. "This isn't charity. This is the new standard. We're not just changing the way we serve. We're changing the way we exist in this industry. And if anyone can't handle that, the door is still open." Peter and Camille weren't in the room. Liora had intentionally left the spaces they once occupied empty, a silent reminder that no one was untouchable. Victor stood in the corner, silent as ever, but his presence was as good as a notarized seal. Everything Liora said was backed by the full weight of law and finance. An older waitress broke the silence, her voice trembling. "Ma'am, what about those of us who are used to the old way?" Liora didn't flinch. "Then they'll either learn to do it the right way or they'll leave. We will not build a new empire on old habits." Silence followed. But it wasn't fear. It was the stillness of people realizing they'd been given a choice: become part of something bigger or walk away from it. "Training starts this week," Liora concluded, "and I hope you'll all stay. But I won't keep anyone here against their will." Some nodded, others still hesitated, but everyone knew one thing: Liora wasn't bluffing. This was the new reality of Le Périgord. And soon, each of them would have to decide where they really belonged. Liora hadn't stepped away from the head of the table when a man in a server's uniform rose from the back row. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, voice tight, "we were just following the rules. We didn't want to treat guests like that, but that's how this place has always been run." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. A younger server spoke up, hands twisting in her apron. "We don't decide who gets served. We follow orders. We don't want to lose our jobs." The room erupted, half defending themselves against blame for a culture they didn't create, half waiting to see how their new boss would respond. Liora didn't cut them off. She let it all spill out raw and unfiltered. When the noise finally settled, she turned slowly to Victor. He nodded, pulling a thick folder from his briefcase and placing it in front of her. "Rules," Liora repeated, her voice level but carrying the weight of a judge about to deliver a sentence. She opened the folder, pulling out pages dense with text and numbers. "Here are 3 years of customer complaints. Here are reviews on public platforms." And this, she held up a single page, as a discrimination lawsuit that was submitted to management and ignored. She walked toward the man who had spoken, her eyes locked on his. "Show me which rule in here says you can rip apart a guest's dignity in front of them. Show me which rule says that humiliation is acceptable." The man dropped his gaze. He had no answer. The murmurs died instantly, leaving a charged, heavy quiet in their place. "You're right," Liora said, her tone sharp as a blade. "You were following the rules. But those rules turned you into tools instead of people, and I will not build a new restaurant on tools who only know how to nod." A young waitress, her voice barely steady, asked, "Then what do you want us to be?" Liora scanned the room, letting her eyes land on each of them in turn. "I want you to be people who can tell right from wrong and choose to stand on the side of right. I want you to serve more than food. I want you to serve respect." Some looked down. Others met her gaze defiantly, not ready to be convinced, but none of them could say they didn't understand her. Victor placed another stack of documents on the table, a quiet reminder that Liora's words weren't just speeches. They were backed by data, by lawsuits, by stories of real pain that had been brushed aside for years. Liora inhaled, as if drawing strength for her final words. The old rules are dead, and anyone who wants to cling to them can leave with them. The room felt heavier, but beneath the tension, something had begun to shift. And Liora knew this was just the first crack in a rotting wall she was about to tear down. She paused, folding her hands over the table, her tone softening not with weakness but with weight. "My father," she began, "was a good man. He worked his whole life, paid his taxes, raised his kids to believe that if you do the right thing, the world will do right by you. One day, he took me to a nice restaurant like this one. They didn't look at the bill he could pay. They didn't see him as a man. They saw his skin." She stopped. The room went silent. "They told us, 'We don't serve people like you.'" Her voice didn't shake, but each word landed like stone. I will never forget the look in his eyes that day. The look of a man swallowing humiliation so his daughter wouldn't see him break. She straightened her shoulders, pulling strength from the memory. "He isn't here to see this day. But I stand here for him. I stand here to make sure no child ever watches their parent be shamed in a place they paid to be treated with dignity." A server in the back wiped away a tear. Glenn, the young security guard still posted at the door, glanced down at the hands that had nearly dragged her out of the dining room. He clenched them into fists not in anger, but in a quiet vow to himself to do better. Liora looked around the room one final time. "That's why we change. Not because I want to, not because I can, but because if we don't, we are complicit in letting stories like my father's keep happening." She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Victor closed the folder with a soft but decisive thud, like sealing the coffin of an outdated era. Liora left the room without another word, leaving her employees in heavy, necessary silence. 6 weeks later, Le Périgord was no longer the Le Périgord of that night. The brittle, pretentious air was gone, replaced with a warmth Manhattan rarely offered genuine smiles from staff, real greetings, and diners of every color and class sharing tables once reserved for the right kind of people. The glowing sign still read Le Périgord, but beneath it, a new line had been added. A Bennett hospitality experience. And this was only the beginning of what Liora Bennett had planned. 6 weeks later, Le Périgord, or more precisely, Le Périgord under Bennett hospitality was no longer the suffocating shrine to elitism it had been that night. It hadn't been transformed by a few potted plants or new light fixtures, but by a complete rebirth. The change was obvious the moment you walked through its glass doors. The once impenetrable reception desk, where unworthy guests were quietly turned away, had become a place of welcome. A young hostess with braided hair and a bright smile greeted guests with "Welcome. Would you like to try today's signature dish?" A simple question, but one loaded with the kind of recognition many had long been denied in this room. The menu had changed. Too, the pretentious all-French listings were now punctuated by dishes drawn from everywhere, Oaxacan-style tacos next to classic boeuf bourguignon, Caribbean bean stew sharing space with foie gras, and a Vietnamese vegetarian dish crafted by a young chef from Hue. Some critics called it chaotic. Liora called it an honest reflection of Manhattan. The clientele had changed as well. Gone were the uniform faces of a self-selected social club hiding behind invisible walls. Now, white-clothed tables hosted a lively mix, a group of young artists in the corner trading ideas, a black family celebrating a mother's 60th birthday, a Middle Eastern couple dining beside a laughing, hand-holding queer pair. Every table was a mosaic piece of the city, a mural, Le Périgord had one refused to hang. The staff had changed, too. Employees who once kept their heads down now stood taller, speaking to guests like people, not props. Glenn, the young security guard who'd once been ordered to drag Liora out, now wore a fitted suit as the head of guest services and security, his confidence signaling he had finally found his rightful place. The walls still bore the old portraits of white men in tuxedos, but they now shared space with new art from local creators, a vibrant painting of Harlem's bustling markets, a colorful sketch of Little Haiti, and a striking portrait of an African woman in a wide-brimmed hat, staring forward defiantly as if to remind anyone who entered that the past's gaze was no longer the only one that mattered. One prominent food critic wrote, "Le Périgord once existed only for a single class. Now, it is where all of Manhattan can see itself." But for Liora, that wasn't enough. She hadn't rebirthed this place to win applause. She'd done it to send a message power can transform a space if the one holding it knows exactly what they're doing. And tonight, as she walked in for her first unannounced post-relaunch visit, Liora knew this was only the beginning, because the people who had once opposed her, or those like them, would not let this go unanswered. That night, she chose a table near the window, a seat that let her watch the entire dining room without drawing attention. She liked sitting like an ordinary patron while seeing everything new staff learning to greet with genuine warmth instead of robotic politeness. New guests entering without fear of being silently judged. The buzz of real conversation filled the room, replacing the performative hush that had once made the restaurant feel more like an art gallery than a dining space. Laughter mingled with the layered aromas, bold, diverse, unapologetically Manhattan proof that her gamble was paying off. Then came the soft, deliberate clack of a cane. An older man approached, moving slowly but with unmistakable self-possession. His tailored suit was dated but impeccable, a long-time patron, likely one who had once seen himself as part of the restaurant's club. He stopped at her table, his eyes scanning the new menu on the wall, then the room, as if searching for something familiar to cling to. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, his voice gravelly but clear, "this place feels unfamiliar." There was no hostility in the words, but in his eyes. Liora saw the grief of a man mourning the Le Périgord that had catered to him and people like him alone. Liora looked up, her lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. "It does," she said slowly, savoring the weight of each word. Then she leaned in slightly, dropping her voice just enough for him and anyone at the nearby tables who might be listening to hear. "That's the point." A few heads turned, nearby diners exchanged glances, their faces flickering between surprise and quiet delight. The man frowned, unsure whether to be insulted or amused. Liora didn't elaborate. She left her words hanging in the air, a pinprick sharp enough to deflate an entire balloon of outdated expectations. At the next table, Zadie, ever the opportunistic writer, was already typing notes for her next piece. When a restaurant refuses to serve its city, it forgets that the city can buy it and turn it into a mirror of itself. Liora sipped her wine, her gaze drifting to the streets beyond. Outside, Manhattan never stopped moving, and she knew the unfamiliarity that man resented was exactly what had made Le Périgord come alive for the first time in years. But she also knew men like him wouldn't let this stand. They'd be back, not just with complaints. And she was ready, because this game wasn't over. It had only entered its next round. 2 days later, Zadie's feature appeared in one of the city's most read food columns. From symbol of exclusion to icon of belonging, the rebirth of Le Périgord. Under Bennett Hospitality. Zadie didn't just write about the food, though she devoted a section to how the boeuf bourguignon had been reimagined to feel less performative and more approachable. She didn't just praise the staff, though she vividly described the moment Glenn, once ordered to remove Liora, now stood at the entrance with a genuine smile and a heartfelt welcome. What made the piece go viral wasn't the culinary detail or service notes. It was the story, a space that once embodied exclusion, now standing as living proof of transformation. Le Périgord used to be a place where people walked in and instantly understood they weren't welcome. Now, it's where every diner feels like they belong. And the most remarkable thing, it hasn't lost its sophistication. It's found its soul. The article spread like wildfire across social media, sparking reactions, equal parts excitement and challenge. Time for other restaurants to follow suit. Bennett. Hospitality is rewriting the rulebook. We need more spaces like this. In her new Bennett Hospitality office, Liora sat before a sprawling city map dotted with red pins, each one a property her company was negotiating to acquire. Former bastions of selective exclusivity, now in her crosshairs not to preserve their rules, but to break them. Within 3 months, she told Victor, who was reviewing contracts beside her, I want 3 more locations running under this model, not just renovated restaurants reprogrammed mindsets. We're going to turn each one into proof that power can open doors instead of closing them. Victor nodded with his usual composure, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of admiration. When Zadie heard the expansion news, she added a final line to her next column. If Le Périgord was only the rough draft, I can't wait to see the final manuscript. And if this city thinks it already knows Liora Bennett, wait, she's just getting started. And Liora knew Zadie was right. This wasn't just about one restaurant. Her revolution was coming for the whole city and beyond. 3 months after the night Le Périgord changed hands, the name Liora Bennett no longer meant the black woman who bought the restaurant that humiliated her. It had become a concept, a way of doing business passed around in whispers across the restaurant industry, in finance circles, and even in the private clubs that once believed themselves untouchable. In the Bennett Hospitality office, perched on a glass tower overlooking all of Manhattan, a massive board hung on the wall with 4 new names, Davenport's, Maison du Parc, The Garnet Room, Rossi's on 5th, all of them once famous establishments not for their food, but for the way they made some people feel unworthy of a seat at the table. Now they belong to Liora. Intervention Acquisition. Victor read aloud from the bolded header of a report in his hand, as if testing whether the phrase was just a slogan. 3 months, 4 restaurants. I never thought I'd see the day this model scaled so fast. This isn't a model, Liora replied, her eyes fixed on the city map before her, peppered with red pins marking acquired and soon-to-be-acquired locations. It's a statement. We're not just buying them, we're intervening. We're transforming spaces that once treated exclusion as standard practice. On the table lay rows of before and after photos, Davenport's, once a sanctuary for the Familiar Faces Club, now buzzing with a mix of students of every color, the Garnet Room, formerly opulent yet cold, now alive with family dinners and intimate concerts from local artists. Not everyone was celebrating. A handful of conservative op-eds lamented the death of refinement and the invasion of populist service into elite spaces. Liora read every one, marked them in red pen, then set them aside like proof she was exactly on track. You're making powerful enemies, Victor observed, not as a warning, but as acknowledgement. No, Liora said, scanning the next list of pending acquisitions. I'm making them look at what they hate to admit their place at the top isn't untouchable. And if they won't open the door, she tapped the map with a manicured finger. I'll buy the damn door. 3 months, 4 restaurants, and she was nowhere near finished. Her phone buzzed. An email flashed across the screen, Proposal 6 New Locations. Liora smiled. This was no longer about owning restaurants. It was about rewriting the rules one table at a time. And the rules, she knew, were only beginning to make the old guard uncomfortable. That's when the game got interesting. On a Saturday afternoon, Liora visited Davenport's freshly reopened Under Bennett Hospitality. It was no longer the judgment-filled hall where men in suits silently assessed who belonged. No more unspoken memberships. Now, the room pulsed with life laughter from a young family's table, the hushed excitement of a group of startup founders strategizing over lunch, and, in the corner, an elderly woman telling her grandchildren stories about the days she'd never have dared to step foot inside. Liora sat at a modest table by the window, her laptop open but untouched. She preferred listening, catching fragments of these new conversations in a space that once silenced them with cold stares and invisible rules. Miss Bennett. She looked up, a girl, maybe 15, with neatly braided hair and a well-worn hoodie, stood nervously by the table. Her eyes were bright, though uncertain, as if she'd gathered all her courage just to walk over. Can I take a picture with you?" Liora tilted her head, smiling gently. "Of course. But tell me, why do you want this picture?" The girl hesitated, then blurted out in one breath, "Because you make me believe that people like us belong in places like this." Liora froze, not because the words were dramatic, but because they cut straight to the bone. She saw herself at 15 in that girl standing outside the pool club, fists clenched, too scared to walk in. She rose and placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "What's your name?" "Amira," the girl said, wide-eyed. "Amira," Liora repeated, slow and steady. "Never forget where you come from, and always listen to others. That's how you keep from becoming like the people who once made you feel you didn't belong." Amira nodded hard, as if committing each word to memory. Liora took the picture with her, then leaned down and whispered, "And if anyone ever tells you you don't belong here, remember, you don't need their permission to exist anywhere." When Amira left, Liora sat again, but her mind wasn't as still as before. The girl's words had pulled her back to it all. Her father, her mother, those cold glances that once shoved her out of spaces not meant for her. Victor entered and noticed her distant expression. "Thinking about the bigger game again?" he asked. She closed the laptop and smiled faintly. "No, I'm thinking about why we started this game." Outside the window, Manhattan churned cars, people, relentless movement. But to Liora, the city no longer looked like a map of other people's power. It looked like a chessboard, and the pieces were moving under new rules. And she knew those who wanted her kept outside still didn't understand who owned the game now. As the crowd thinned, Liora lingered at her table, soaking in the glow of warm lights falling over what had once been an altar to exclusion and was now living proof of her mission. Amira and her family were gone, but the girl's words still echoed, "You make me believe people like us belong here." She smiled, a mix of pride and weight. Every acquisition, every tense negotiation with old owners, every late-night strategy session had never been just about restaurants. It had been about moments like this, a 15-year-old girl believing the world had a door open for her, right where it once would have slammed shut. Victor returned, setting a thick folder on her table. 6 new locations, he said, businesslike as ever. If we sign, we'll be in neighborhoods no one imagined us entering. Liora didn't open the folder yet. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, eyes still on the street outside. 3 months had been a whirlwind, 4 restaurants flipped, countless headlines, praise mixed with backlash. But in this moment, she thought only of one thing: her father, the man who had been denied a simple seat at a table, would he smile if he saw her now? She turned to Victor, her voice soft yet heavy with finality. Sometimes, the strongest response to being denied a seat is to own the whole table. Victor nodded once, no questions. He understood. Liora rose, adjusting her blazer. She knew the storms weren't over. There would be more pushback. More doors slammed shut, but she was no longer waiting for anyone to open them. She was buying those doors and replacing the hinges with ones that could never close again. At the doorway, she paused, taking one last look not just at the restaurant, but at the journey from that night at Le Perigord to this moment, the journey of turning humiliation into strategy, pain into legacy. Then she stepped out into the rushing streets of Manhattan, carrying the quiet certainty that the next tables she claimed wouldn't just belong to the self-anointed privileged few. Leora's story was no longer just hers. It was a reminder to anyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong, you can leave quietly, or you can come back and own the room. And what about you? Have you ever been denied a place? If you had the power, what would you change? Share your story, because the next table set just might be yours. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.